少し回っているように紹介されまして。
どうもありがとうございます。置いていただきまして嬉しいです。本当せっかくの機会なので。それで、先生、はい。少し参加することでですね。休憩の時にご一緒によかったら、はい、お誘いしてるので。はい、わかりました。
歴史はあまり専門なんですけど、今日ちょうどいいお話なので、はい、聞かせていただきます。
Last week the students came one by one.
Oh, so a very bad habit.
We can wait for another minute or two, but then we'll see. They all came in the end, but it took a while.
Is it different from your King's College?
Yeah, I mean, normally in Britain they either turn up at the beginning, or they don't come. But they don't come in halfway through. But it's obviously just a different.
British people still have punctuality.
Yes, we're terribly punctual. I realise that when I'm in other countries. Many Europeans always start things late, whereas we always start on time.
Yeah, Japanese used to be like that.
Germans are punctual, but always 15 minutes late. They have something called the academic quarter hour. So everything always starts 15 minutes later than they say it's going to start. It's very strange.
The Japanese universities imported that system and American system of having breaks.
Right.
So,
yeah. It's easier.
Do you have enough space?
Yeah, it's much easier for me to see the screen closer to people. Yeah. Yeah, because then I can see the screen while I'm talking and know when to move it.
Maybe you don't have to wait.
No, I'll start now. It's nice to see you again. Those who are here, and the others will come eventually. And today I'm going to talk about the history of welfare states in Europe. Talking a little more about Britain, but this week more about other countries also. And I want to start by discussing the term welfare state, where it comes from. It originates in German. It's a translation of the German term Wohlfahrtsstaat. And this was originally used in Germany in the late 19th century by people who were critical of the new welfare introduced by Bismarck in Germany in the 1880s, which I'll talk about later. They used it critically to mean that that he was creating a state that made workers dependent on the state rather than independent workers. The term was translated into English as welfare state and adopted in Britain in the 20th century. But again, originally very critically, when the Labour government in Britain after 1945 introduced new welfare measures like better pensions and a national health service, which again I'll talk about later. Conservative opponents used the term welfare state, again critically, to suggest that the state was doing too much for people. They should do more to help themselves. But increasingly then in the 1950s, the term was used favourably to mean a state that really tried to do good to people. And this more favourable usage became commonplace. It's different from the way Americans use the term welfare, which is much more, again, as a term to suggest that people are dependent. Living on welfare is seen as a demeaning and a bad thing, whereas in general in Europe it's seen as an acceptable thing. I feel that in Britain, under our present Conservative government, it's taking on the American meaning, but I'll talk about that later. They're very influenced by right-wing Americans. Right, well that's just to explain where the term welfare state came from, because it's so commonplace in Europe now. What it actually meant, and has come to mean, certainly since the Second World War, is that nation-states devote their resources to reducing deprivation and poverty among the population, and to providing essential services, including pensions, healthcare, education. This was a contrast to the way the role of the state was seen in most of 19th century Europe, where it was believed that the state should hold back and encourage the free markets and the growth of the economy. Those were seen, even in the 19th century, most governments were doing rather more to help the welfare of the population. So by the period after the Second World War, nation-states, certainly throughout Western Europe, non-communist Europe, came to define this as an essential part of their role, ensuring to some degree an adequate standard of living for their citizens. And this also included trying to provide enough work for employment as well as welfare. Within the welfare states, priorities for expenditure and forms of provision have varied quite a lot from place to place. And again, I'll discuss this more as I go along. Social insurance, providing for pensions, unemployment, health, is a core welfare activity of most states. But welfare services can include a great variety of activities, such as school meals, home nursing, subsidised transport, daycare centres for older people, free or subsidised legal services, regulation of working hours and wages and conditions. Different governments do more of these things than others, but all of these activities and others can come under the general definition of a welfare state. And of course, provision of education, health and healthcare and housing are extremely important. But the welfare state is very much a creation of the 20th century, and particularly the second half of the 20th century in Europe. Before the 20th century, most countries had some kind of publicly provided poor relief system, often provided at a local level and financed at a local level. Britain had what was called a poor law from as early as 1601, which was administered at a local level and financed by local taxes, but within a framework of national law. And its purpose was to give basic support to people who lived in the local community, who couldn't support themselves and who didn't have families to help them. The obligation of families to help their family members was written into the law. And the poor law and this obligation continued in Britain until 1948. This meant that not only parents had responsibility for children, and children as they grew up for their parents, but also grandparents had responsibility for grandchildren, grandchildren for grandparents. But the poor law did not expect families to help the poor if they were themselves too poor. The poor law existed to support those families who were too poor to help themselves and to help people who had no family and couldn't work. It was a very local system, and so aid was refused to immigrants from other districts. If they stayed long enough in the district, they could acquire a right to relief. But new immigrants were refused. So rather in the way that modern states refuse welfare to new immigrants, except on certain conditions, and until they become citizens of the country, or they give them less favourable welfare treatment. So the local districts did this in the past. So hostility to strangers in welfare systems is nothing new. The help that they gave mainly consisted of basic finance, small sums of money if they needed it. The poor law would also provide clothing, food, housing. For example, poor widows would be helped to share a house and support one another. Old people might be put in the houses of younger widows who could look after them and also needed support from poor relief. The poor law also provided basic health care, and the people who benefited most were older people, widows, orphans, unmarried mothers. In fact, everyone who was judged, disabled people, everyone who was judged not able to work for a living, those who could work were expected to do so, to support themselves. This continued until the early 19th century, until in 1834 the poor law was tightened up, became more restrictive still. In particular, to punish people who didn't work. There was quite high unemployment, and it was believed that people were not working because they were lazy, not because there was not enough work. And so people who were thought to be fit to work were placed in new institutions called workhouses, which were newly built in each district and were rather like prisons. They were deliberately unpleasant places to live. They were meant to be less comfortable than the home of the poorest person in the community, so that nobody would go to them unless they were desperate. So it's an attempt to drive people to find work, even though work was not always available, but that wasn't always understood. This system continued into the late 19th century. In fact, it continued well into the 20th century, but it was increasingly criticised as being too harsh on people who were poor through no fault of their own. It's partly because by the later 19th century, there's greater understanding of how economies work, and that unemployment could happen because of the cycle of the economy. There's problems in the economy, and not always just because people were lazy. And also recognition that people's poverty had many different causes, such as old age, sickness, or unemployment. And the different causes of poverty, people needed different kinds of help. But alongside the poor relief system in most countries for centuries also, there was a great deal of voluntary welfare provided by members of the community, often through religious organisations. And they also helped people in real need. For example, by founding hospitals, orphanages, care homes for older people, and for other kinds of need, generally less punitively than the poor law did. But they worked always very closely with the official poor law system, and the poor law might refer people who it thought were very poor but deserved good treatment to voluntary organisations. I'll talk next week more about the history of voluntary action, which in Britain, but also in other European countries, has always worked very closely with state action. So that was the poor relief system in Britain before the welfare state. There were different arrangements in other European countries, and the differences are too complicated to try to describe. But every country had some sort of system of basic and usually local help for the poorest people. And usually that was supplemented also by voluntary action, as I say, often provided by the churches. So the poor everywhere had a basic possibility of support before the welfare state, but it was very basic. And through the 19th century, most states, particularly in northwestern Europe, particularly the larger countries, took on more welfare responsibilities, particularly encouraging education generally, as economies grew, governments wanted to improve standards of education in order to improve people's skills, because this was good for the economy. Also, in many European countries, a national education system was thought to be important for nation building, particularly in the newly formed countries, such as Germany, that was unified in 1870, Italy, that was also unified around the same time, to give people of these new nations a sense of belonging to one nation, building a common language, which was necessary, for example, in France. The education system played this kind of role, but also is economically important. In Britain, it was more economically important because Britain had been a nation state for a long time. The British government subsidised education from the 1840s onwards, but it became compulsory for all children from 1880. And there were similar changes, I say, in other countries. Similarly, governments took on more responsibility for public health, particularly as towns grew. As industrialization spread, towns became larger. They grew in a way that was quite uncontrolled, and overcrowding, dirt and pollution, bad water supplies were causing disease and high death rates. So in order to prevent this, governments introduced controls over the building of towns, the provision of water, the cleaning of towns, gradually through the late 19th and early 20th century, in order to reduce death rates and sickness rates. Also, as factories grew and industries like mining expanded, conditions could be extremely bad. And again, partly for reasons of economic efficiency, but also to protect the population. Governments shortened working hours, improved conditions of work. They also did it increasingly because workers demanded it and were becoming increasingly organised, and governments, for fear of revolt, and there were near revolutions in many parts of Europe in 1848, governments compromised with the demands of workers. So in various ways, already before the later 19th century, governments were taking more responsibility for improving social conditions, partly out of concern for the state of health and living conditions of the population, but also because they were concerned about their own economy, economic success, and political security. But then a very important change came in Germany from the 1880s. Bismarck, who was the first chancellor, the man politically in charge of the newly unified Germany, introduced the first ever national insurance scheme for sick and disabled workers. This was quite new. It compelled certain workers and their employers to pay a weekly contribution administered by the state and in return, they received a sum of money when they were too sick or disabled to work. This built on schemes that some workers had organised for themselves in Germany and in other countries, including Britain, since the beginnings of industrialisation, in order to protect themselves in a situation where there was no welfare state and the poor elite system didn't give great help. They got together in voluntary mutual organisations into which they paid a contribution every week and in return got a benefit when they were sick and unable to work. What Bismarck did was expand to a much wider range of people this system that had existed voluntarily for some time. But it was a scheme that only covered better paid, skilled male workers, because really they were the only people who could afford to pay a regular weekly contribution. It wasn't a great deal, but many people were too poor to pay even that. So it excluded most female workers. Well, it excluded females, whether they were workers or not, and also poorer, more casual, lower paid workers, and agricultural workers, who were most of the workers in Germany, in fact, most in the whole of Europe at this time. So it was a system that benefited better paid male workers, and this was deliberate because the scheme was designed not just to help the workers, but again for political and economic reasons. Bismarck was concerned that the left-wing Social Democratic Party was becoming successful in Germany, was winning the votes of many workers, and also workers were forming trade unions. And Bismarck wanted to convince themselves that his more liberal government could benefit workers just as much as the Social Democrats could. So by providing welfare, he hoped to win their support away from the growing socialist movement. He was also very keen to increase economic growth in Germany. That was equally important. Germany at this time was expanding its industry quite successfully. It was becoming a serious competitor to Britain, and Bismarck wanted to carry on with that, quite understandably. And so it was important to ensure that the most essential workers, the skilled workers in mines and factories, felt secure and also were healthy and so could work as effectively as possible. So again, welfare systems are being introduced not just out of sympathy for workers, but for economic and political goals. And welfare was seen as contributing to economic growth. It's tended in recent years to be criticised for undermining economic growth in advanced economies. But certainly in the early days, welfare improving above all the fitness and so the capacity to work, like providing education so the workers are more skilled, was seen as a really important contributor to expanding economic growth. And this was very much in the mind of Bismarck and his advisors. In 1889, he expanded the system to add pensions So again, in return for an insurance contribution, these German workers received an old age pension. So it's the first state old age pension to be introduced in the modern world. Similar schemes then spread through Northern Europe. Other countries were interested in this new phenomenon, and working people often pressed them to introduce them. And they spread through many countries before 1914. The first to do anything was Denmark, followed by the United Kingdom, and, as you can see, the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, mostly the North European countries. Welfare developed much more slowly, as we'll see, in the south of Europe, which was generally poorer, more agricultural. But it's the rather richer North European countries which can afford to provide this kind of welfare, because the German scheme also cost a certain amount to taxpayers. It was funded by contributions from workers and employers, but the state had to administer it, and the state also provided some of the funds. But the schemes that were introduced in different countries varied. They didn't just adapt the German model. They varied depending on local conditions. I should say that pension schemes were introduced in Australia and New Zealand also at the very end of the 19th century. They were then British colonies, but were very much in the lead in developing new welfare systems. This pension scheme that was introduced in Denmark in 1891, Denmark was the richest of the Scandinavian countries at this time. It was different from the German scheme because it was targeted at the poorest people, not at the rather better off workers, but it was designed to help the very poor, most of whom were women, because it was recognizing that there were many people who were very poor in old age. They weren't poor because they were lazy, but they worked hard all their lives. They'd never earned enough money to be able to save for their later lives. They often did not have children who could help them because their children were very poor, or given high death rates at that time, the children might be dead. So there were many older people who, having led very virtuous, hard-working lives, were very poor in later life. So the Danish pension system was targeted at the poorest workers. There was an income test. You only received it if you had a very low income. And also, it only went to people who had records of behaving respectably. If they had a criminal record or in the past had been drunken or in some way had behaved badly, they were disqualified from the pension. And a very similar system was introduced in Britain in 1908, also aimed at the very poorest and excluding people who had behaved badly, if they'd been imprisoned for crime, if they'd been accused, if they'd been imprisoned or penalised for drunkenness. In the last few years, they didn't receive a pension. So it's very poor, hard-working, respectable people when they get old. So essentially, both in Denmark and Britain, when pensions were introduced, they were meant to be improvements on the poor relief system, rather than rewards for skilled workers, as in Germany. The principles are very different, and they applied to different people. Above all, in Britain also, most of the pensioners were women, because women lived longer than men and were more likely to be poor in old age. Whereas under insurance systems, men were the main beneficiaries. So there are very real differences. And in Britain, as in Denmark, the pension system grew out of growing criticism of the poor relief system, and particularly that it was too harsh to poor old people who'd worked hard all their lives. And it's partly also because the number of older people was growing somewhat, that there was more concern about them. But again, all these schemes, similar schemes were introduced in the Netherlands and in Sweden. They differ on details, including the age at which the pension was paid. This varied between about 55 and 70. It was paid at 70 in Britain, which was really very high, given life expectancy at the time. But the British government was not prepared to spend too much money on the pension. And one way of cutting down the expense was to pay it at age 70, because by that time, lots of people were dead, and so they didn't really need a pension. Another characteristic of state welfare, including pensions at this time, was that it excluded immigrants, just as the poor relief system had excluded people from other districts. Pensions in Britain, in Denmark, I'm not sure about Germany, excluded immigrants from other countries who were not naturalized citizens of the British Isles. So, for example, Jewish immigrants were excluded from the British pensions and later from health insurance. As I said in last week's lecture, Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, they were the largest group of immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century. Those of them who did not become British subjects were excluded from the new welfare benefits. And so also were women who married immigrant men who were not, if the women themselves might have been born British citizens, but they lost their citizenship when they married someone who was not a citizen. And even if they were widowed when they qualified for a pension, they were excluded. There was a lot of protest about this when people realized, and the law was modified to include the widows of immigrants who were not British subjects. But the tradition of excluding immigrants was embedded in the new welfare schemes in many European countries. In 1911, the United Kingdom was the first country to introduce unemployment insurance. This was like sickness insurance as introduced by Bismarck. Bismarck introduced unemployment insurance rather later. But again, workers and their employers paid a contribution, and when they were unemployed, received a benefit. At the same time, in 1911, Britain introduced health insurance, again, this time adopting the German model. And again, as in Germany, an important motive was to help to boost the economy. Because, again, it was skilled workers, better off male workers, who were included in insurance schemes because only they could afford the contributions. And the main purpose was to keep them fit and healthy and able to work. And similarly, when they were unemployed, to keep them in good shape for when they went back to work. It was accompanied in Britain by establishing offices where workers could go to find out about the work that was available, known as employment exchanges. And unemployment insurance benefits were paid in those offices. So at the time when workers went to collect their benefit, they could also find out what work was available. This was adopting a model that some trade unions had introduced earlier. So the idea of insurance was spreading. But insurance schemes excluded not only immigrants, but also the families of workers. They covered only the insured worker. An exception to that in Britain was the maternity benefit. From 1911, the wives of insured workers, when they had a child, received a sum of money to ensure they got good medical care. This was at a time when there was concern about the high death rates of mothers and children. And this was designed to help to prevent that. There was a campaign by women, because the campaign for the vote, the women's movement is growing, and they demanded that this maternity benefit should be paid directly to the mother. As I said, in the case of family allowances, before, this was to prevent it being paid to the father, who might go and drink it away, rather than giving it to the mother to help her through the birth of the child. So it was paid to the mother. So the kind of welfare provision that's being made is gradually expanding, though it's still quite limited. And the fact that family, for example, under the health insurance scheme in Britain, insured workers had access to a doctor whenever they, and it was free, whenever they were ill. They could use a hospital only if they were suffering from TB, tuberculosis, which was a major killer at the time. So but hospitals couldn't do a great deal for people at this time. They were more likely to die of an infection who got in a hospital than be cured. Being able to go to a doctor and get medicine was more helpful. But their wives and children couldn't. And the only health care that many wives and children could get was through the poor relief system, which by the early 20th century did provide hospitals and medical care, but of a very basic kind. So what were the reasons for this spread of state welfare in various forms at this time? Again, it's not simply a matter of people being concerned about mass poverty and ill health. There are many people who were concerned. And there were a lot of investigations in many European countries of social conditions, which did reveal very severe poverty. For example, a big survey of London in the 1890s showed that about 30% of the population lived in severe poverty. And there are similar studies in Germany and France at this time. So there is a lot of concern about poverty, ill health, bad education. But what's also important is the spread of democracy. The fact that in more countries, more people, more men at first, and then increasingly later more women, are getting the vote. And as a larger section of the population has a vote, governments have to listen to them and their needs. At the same time, in the late 19th century, the socialist movement was developing. I mentioned it in Germany, but there are socialist parties of various kinds growing in most, certainly North European countries at this time. And trade unionism was also growing. And they were demanding better social conditions. And politicians from the more centre and right-wing parties feel they have to listen to them. There's also a growing women's movement everywhere. Women were beginning to gain the vote and also demanding improvement, particularly for mothers and children, but in fact for everybody. Also important was war. It became particularly important during the First World War, 1914 to 18, where governments felt that in order to keep the support of the population for the war, they had to deliver better social conditions, if not during the war, then afterwards, as a reward. And you can certainly see in Britain, immediately after the First World War, much more state investment in housing for working people, in education, in unemployment benefits, and in healthcare. Also very important, particularly in the years before, during, and just after the First World War, was the fear that I mentioned last week, that birth rates were falling everywhere, and that increasingly urbanized populations were unhealthy, with high rates of sickness and death, and that these would weaken the nations of Europe in competition with the rest of the world, and also in competition with one another. And Britain was worried about its falling birth rate and its high sickness rate because it was concerned about Germany as a future enemy. And no doubt the Germans were equally worried about Britain as a future enemy and about France. So there's great fear by governments that their populations were becoming smaller and weaker, so they'd be less able to succeed in a world in which there was growing economic competition and also growing political competition and fear of war. The other thing that's happening before the First World War is competition among the European countries to build up colonies around the world. And again, they fear they won't win that race unless they have strong, healthy, fit, and well-educated populations. So all of these fears contribute to increasing demands for better welfare. For example, in Britain, the fears about the falling birth rate and high death rates contributed to improved care for infants and mothers. to the provision of free meals in schools for poor children so they grow up healthy, and the introduction of medical inspection and medical care for poor children at school. So building up the next generation particularly, to ensure that the country was competitive in future was a real priority. And the First World War strengthened this because so many young men were killed in the war. Replacing them by ensuring there was a healthy young population coming through was an important priority. And it was one that women's movements could take advantage of, because it meant politicians were listening more carefully than usual when they demanded better care for mothers and children. So they were able to use that political moment to be successful. So state welfare began to get established in the early 20th century for a lot of very complicated reasons, which have as much to do with the desire for economic growth and success in war, as with humanitarian concern for poorer people. It's a mix of all of these changes. And there's a concern about the internal political stability of countries. If you keep protesting workers happy, then they're less likely to cause trouble and instability. So after the First World War, there's a further spread of welfare activities, particularly where there are social democratic governments in place. For example, in Weimar Germany after World War I. Something else that's impelling change between the wars is countries of Western Europe being very worried about the 1917 Russian Revolution and the fear that similar socialist movements will grow in their own countries unless they can show the mass of the population that liberal governments can provide for them. And it's particularly important, I think, in the 1920s and 30s that there are more people have to vote, both men and women, in more countries. So there's greater pressure on government to meet the needs of the mass of the population. The right-wing governments that grew in Italy from the early 1920s, in Germany and Spain and Portugal from the 1930s, also both continued the welfare measures that were already in place in their countries. There were very few in Spain. Also developed new ones, particularly to try to boost the birth rate for the kinds of reasons I've already given, but also to win the support of the population. But what these countries had in common was their exclusion of people they regarded as coming from impure races who would pollute their own race, such as Jews and Gypsies. So even if they had citizenship, like many of the Jews in Germany who were German citizens and long-time residents, the very fact that they're Jews excludes them. It's a racial rather than a test, rather than one of citizenship, which had been the conventional one. So the right-wing governments expand welfare in many ways, but only for those people of their population that they judge to be pure members of the nation. Also in Soviet Russia, after 1917, as it grew, there's a growing range of state-directed benefits, state-funded rather than paid for by contributions, again mainly focused on industrial workers, though later the peasants were included. And Soviet Russia in its early days was very poor, had limited resources. But there was an expanding range of benefits, particularly for the towns and particularly for workers, which continued to expand through the 20s and 30s and beyond. In most of Western Europe, there's a continued expansion despite the fact of economic depression in the 1920s and 30s, which pervaded Europe with very high levels of unemployment, particularly in Britain, which had probably the longest period of unemployment from 1920 through to 1940. But in spite of this, there's the growth of welfare provision. Again, it's the opposite to what we've become used to in the late 20th century, when whenever there's an economic crisis, welfare gets cut. In this earlier phase of economic growth, welfare was seen as essential to revival of the economy. Again, by helping people to get fit, by building schools, hospitals, better housing for workers, better facilities, better roads, baths, community centres of various kinds. You created work for people by the very fact of building them, and you created a healthier and stronger workforce for the future. And so there are improvements in healthcare, in housing, in many places provided by employers for the same sort of reason, and not just by the state. Improvements in education, more schools built and educating people to a higher level, despite the fact of depression and unemployment. It's partly the attempt to revive the economy. It's partly also the pressure from this expanded, more democratic electorate, pressure from the women's movement. And very real fears that in a period of high unemployment, unemployed people would become politically active, would become more socialist. And again, the fear of a revolution, as in Russia, helps to fuel governments in giving more benefits to unemployed people. So, despite the recession of the 1920s and 30s, it's generally a period of expansion in welfare provision. Sorry, that's what I've just been saying. I thought I'd got another slide. So for all of these very complicated reasons, by the time of World War II, most European countries were to some degree welfare states, though still in limited ways, and they emphasized different things. And this was true even though their political regimes might be quite different. The communist country, Soviet Russia, provided welfare on its terms. The fascist, the right-wing governments provided welfare on their terms, and so did the more liberal capitalist governments of Western and Northwest Europe. They all have their own motives for providing slightly different kinds of welfare, but all moving in the same direction of providing a great deal more for most of the population than had been in place at the beginning of the century. So I'll stop there for a while and we can have some questions and then have a break and then start again. So any questions or comments? So I have to try and cover quite a lot of ground.
If there's nobody, it might be the topic of the next lecture, but I was really intrigued by the point you raised about the difference between the situation in the end of 20th century and early part of 20th century. People's attitude toward welfare in economic crisis. So what is the reason of the difference? Now people don't look at welfare as the way to economic recovery.
Mm. I don't, that's not easy to answer because, I mean, I suppose the simple answer would be to say that economies were still less developed in those days. And obviously they had a long way to go to improve standards of education and health. So perhaps probably more needed to be done. But you can still make the same case now that there are a lot of people who need more education, more healthcare. And that the money really isn't wasted. But it's perhaps harder to prove now when more people are healthier and better educated. I think then the deficiencies were so obvious. There was so much to catch up with to improve conditions that it was harder to argue against. But I don't think that's the whole answer. I don't quite understand it. I think it's a very interesting contrast. Of course, it's only for the first time at this time that there are economists like John Maynard Keynes pointing out how important it is to spend in order to increase demand and regenerate the economy. So there are quite new ideas coming in. And something else I didn't mention that's important, I forgot when I was talking between the wars, is the emergence of new international organizations. I mean, very important in the 1920s and 30s was the League of Nations, which was set up after the First World War. It's the predecessor of the United Nations. And the idea was to provide a forum where all the nations of the world can get together in the hope that by talking to one another, they'll avoid another war. And of course, it didn't succeed. But one of the things the League of Nations did was set up other institutions. rather as the United Nations did. And an important one was the International Labour Office. And it saw its role as advising governments on how to both improve welfare and working conditions and improve their economies. And influential economists had a lot of influence on it. And the ILO, as it was called, then promoted their ideas to governments. So it's an international organisation telling governments it's a good idea to have more welfare. If your population is fitter, better educated, has better work conditions, then it's good for your economy. They also promote maternity benefits from 1916, saying, you know, you'll help your women workers, they'll be fitter when they come back to work if they have maternity leave and pay. So they're a very important organisation, rather as the European Union, since it was set up, has been important in promoting ideas of welfare in Europe. The League of Nations was doing similar things, also promoting racial and gender equality. It's quite an interesting organisation. Though it failed to stop the war, but it did some of it.
I have a comment, and it's sort of a question, and it's also related to the previous question. You talked about the welfare state as something that was seen, or those policies that had that were aimed at doing something like getting attention away from the social democrats, etc. But I think by now, the welfare state itself is a value in itself, and something that is valuable in itself. And therefore, I think that what you said earlier, that people see the welfare state as an obstacle to economic recovery. I'm not really sure if that's the case. I mean, looking at Germany, the discussions aren't about should we do away with the welfare state, altogether. It's always within the welfare state how many percentage points of the paycheck should go to welfare. So it's those are really tiny debates considered. Like, they aren't about the welfare state, they are within the welfare state system. So
there are important differences across Europe, which is why talking about Europe is difficult. I'm thinking very much of the present situation in Britain, where we really do have a government that seems very determined to dismantle the welfare state, and I'm very concerned about it. And it really is saying these kinds of things, that in order for the economy to revive, we've got to slash almost everything. There was another big demonstration by students yesterday about the cuts to universities and the great increase in fees they're going to. I think there won't be any people. So I think Britain is extreme in this, whereas the other countries of Western Europe are much more dedicated to the welfare state, which is a much more accepted institute. I'm much more worried about what's happening in Britain, and I think Germany is much safer, or France. Or,
if we look at Greece, for example, they're in dire straits right now, but they still don't do away with pensions. I mean, they're still, once the pensions, the unemployment, and health benefits are established, and they're become a value in themselves, nobody really talks about getting rid of them, but only talking about, like, okay, let's have people, exactly, let's have people for 3 years longer. It's the same thing, but I guess it's less generous.
Yeah. And also there's a case for raising pension ages, for the reason we've discussed before, that people are fit to later ages. But say in Ireland, which is the latest country to be in a big mess, they're talking very much the way the British government's talking, and are cutting welfare benefits. So there's a big difference between the countries that are much more embedded in the European Union.
this point again. Don't you think there's an effect of the disappearance of the fear of socialist revolution?
Yes, that's probably it too, yes. Yeah. That there isn't that fear impelling them any longer, particularly since 1989. Because really, socialist movements are not particularly strong anywhere.
Compared with other European countries, the US doesn't seem to be that the government has turned into a comprehensive welfare state, in that the state only provides part of the public expenditure. Many of the population has been excluded from the public medical expenditure, etc. Have you got some comments on the history of U.S. welfare state?
Well, the US is very different from Europe. It obviously doesn't have the same tradition and does have a very, and the debate about health insurance in the United States look quite bizarre from Europe. They're really quite terrifying. The way they don't seem to understand that 40% of the population has no health care. And they regard the European systems as far left socialism, that just provides adequate health care for most people. I don't understand the United States. I do find it, I mean, it is very different. And it's such a diverse country. I mean, most of the people I know in the United States are actually quite sensible, liberal, left-minded people who are as horrified as I am by what's going on. And there's obviously a very strong right-wing movement at the moment. But I am worried that that's influencing our government a bit too much, and we've always been rather closer to the United States than many other European countries. And what's amazing about the United States is they can continue with these massive social divisions without much upheaval. So there are, social inequality is enormous. The infant mortality rate is one of the worst in the world. It's well, a lot worse than Cuba, which is rather good, but is massively poor. It's extraordinary.
So the term welfare still have the meaning of dependency on the.
Well, it does in the
US.
United States, yes, and that's been a difference in language. But what is worrying is the way our new government has started using it in just that way, as though being on welfare is something terrible, that people should be despised and forced to work, which I don't think would be how people would talk in Germany or in most other Western European countries. It hasn't been the way they've spoken in Britain, and most people still don't. And perhaps this government won't last, but the change in language in a few months is really quite disturbing.
I know some people started to use the term social investment. Thai demographers who gave lectures last year didn't use the term welfare. In the context we should call welfare. Instead, they use the term social investment because they said welfare is not a good word. It means dependency.
Yeah.
Dependency. Mm.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because it is social investment, and that's clearly how it was actually being thought of in the early 20th century. And it wasn't, the language wasn't there then.
Mm.
But that's what they're talking about. If you're saying we need to spend more on healthcare, education, housing, that is social investment. And maybe that's the language that needs to be, I mean, certainly, as I said at the very beginning, the idea of a welfare state in the very early days was used very critically by opponents of Bismarck in Germany and opponents of the Labour government in Britain, precisely because they thought welfare meant dependency. And William Beveridge, who I'll talk about later, who was produced the great blueprint for the post-Second World War welfare state in Britain, he didn't like the term welfare state for that reason. He preferred the term social service state, which again has got similar connotations. You encourage that it exists to serve the population rather than make them dependent and improve the population. So I think welfare has had ambiguous meaning, and then it took on this very favourable meaning in Europe from the 1950s onwards, and retains it in most European countries. I don't know what's happening in Sweden at the moment, because they had a more right-wing government elected recently. Haven't heard much about what's going on. Can't be as bad as ours.
Any more questions or comments? May I ask one more? So can we include Soviet Union and fascist countries in the concept of welfare state?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Which people debate quite a lot, or historians debate in Europe. And the inclination has been to say no, and it's only liberal democracies that can have real welfare states. And certainly, if you say that a welfare state should be inclusive of everybody in the population, the fact that the fascist states excluded certain people, but then we've always excluded people if they happen not to be British or Dutch or whatever. They're not in the same sort of racist terms, and we didn't, of course, try to exterminate them. And Russian welfare, I mean Soviet communist welfare, would often be punitive as well as beneficial to people. That if they didn't work or didn't behave themselves, they could be punished. But there's always been a certain punitive element in other welfare states. So it's difficult. It depends how you define what you think a welfare state is doing. In terms of simply providing certain services, they all did it, but they did it in different ways, depending on the political ideology.
It is becoming an actual question because now we meet people from post-communist countries or still communist countries in conferences for social policy. So sometimes the Chinese scholars use the classifications scheme by Espin Andersen to understand their situation. But that is the classification of welfare capitalism, but they do not mind to use categories to explain Chinese current situation.
Right. I mean, I don't think Espin Andersen's categories are very helpful for anybody because they're too crude, and they do lump Britain in with America much too easily, and I think wrongly. It's hard to see China as a welfare state, but also I suppose it does provide some benefits for many people. I think we need much more complex typologies than Espin Andersen's or any other that we've got to analyse the differences in social welfare regimes. I mean, certainly the European communist countries did provide very comprehensively, and since 1989, many of them got very much worse systems, say of childcare, which very much deteriorated. Pensions have got very much worse. Unemployment and the gap in income has increased enormously. I mean, East Germany was an exception because it was able to be absorbed into West Germany at a certain cost, but it was, but Poland, Hungary, particularly, many services got very much worse.
So you were telling those countries were better welfare state than now.
Well, I think some of them did certainly have better provision for people, and there was a downside as well, but in terms of certainly childcare, pensions, in some cases healthcare, it has got worse. Its pensioners are going to suffer very badly in many of those countries, and in Russia. Break, or do you want to ask another question? Right, let's break for 15 or 20 minutes.
So shall we go to the sociology department?
And welfare, actually, Wohlfahrt, as I was using Wohlfahrtsstaat, is actually something that would be given to very needy people, like gifts and those kinds of donations.
So that's more like the American use.
But no, well,
but without the pejorative.
It comes without that. There's no like negative meaning to it, and you can't say somebody is on welfare in German. Because somebody would be on social help, which would be different. And there's something that the Social Democrats introduced a couple of years ago, which is called the man who came up with a new restructured unemployment benefits. His name was Hans, and now his plan has to, kind of infamously become the new name for the way that unemployment benefits are being. Yeah. So if you want to talk badly about people being on unemployment benefits, then you would use that Hans Fear being that form, just the plan he came up with. So there's a little bit of a majority.
And we don't have an equivalent to social staff as a term. The subtleties of terminology which across the countries, but they stand for different ideas, different conceptions of the state as well. It's very interesting. That's all. Somebody tell me which.
Sorry. I can help.
Right, yes, sorry. I had it last week, but
Yeah, it's not easy.
it looks different. It looks different from last week. Right, well, to carry on from 1945, from where I stopped before, welfare states, particularly in North and Western Europe, expanded during and after World War II, particularly fast under governments in countries which didn't suffer occupation or very severe hardship during the war, such as United Kingdom and Sweden. Sweden was neutral and not involved in the war. A social democratic government had been elected just before the war and then remained in power for 44 years, and it continued the expansion of the economy and welfare provision through the war. The United Kingdom, of course, was closely involved in the war, but it expanded welfare and planned further changes for after the war, partly to increase support for the war among the population and make them feel positive despite the hardships of bombing and the other hardships of the war, and also to give the feeling that they would be rewarded after the war for their sacrifices during the war. So during the war, there were plans developed by the government for the expansion of social insurance, of education and health, plans that were implemented after the war by a Labour government. It was the first majority Labour government elected in Britain in 1945, and then that expanded what came to be known as a welfare state. But other countries also, particularly as they recovered from the war, expanded welfare, and again for mixed motives. One very important motive in Europe from the late 1940s, well, during and after the war, was to prevent the return of the economic crises of the 1920s and 30s. There was a very strong commitment everywhere to building economies of full employment in place of the high unemployment before the war. And also to prevent the political crises of the interwar years, with the growth of right-wing governments. And also there was competition driven by the Cold War in the late 1940s on both sides of the Iron Curtain to prove the superiority of the two competing world systems after the war, communism of Eastern Europe, and then increased spreading to China and other countries, and the liberal capitalism of Western Europe, supported and subsidized by the United States, which was anxious to encourage liberal democracies and even welfare states in Western Europe in order to make them secure against communism. There was quite a lot of suspicion in the United States of state welfare because it was regarded as too socialist. The kinds of hostilities we were discussing before to things like social medicine. But still the United States did pour a considerable amount of funding into Western Europe to build up its economies and its social provision in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And again, strong welfare provision was seen as contributing to economic recovery and growth. Again, improving healthcare, education, and social services, which although they'd been improving before the war everywhere, there was still a long way to go. There were still quite high death rates, high rates of sickness, large numbers of people not particularly well educated. There were still gaps to be filled. Large inequalities in incomes. So improvements of this kind were seen as essential to developing the economy in the future. It was genuinely social investment again. And the period from the late 1940s through to the mid-1970s has come to be seen as one of the classic European welfare states. With Sweden very much in the lead and seen as setting the standard for other countries, because Sweden is a relatively small country compared, say, with Germany, Britain, France, and with quite the same diversity between rich and poor, but it achieved that partly by very rapid development of social provision from the 1940s onwards. But again, it has to be remembered that in all countries, other institutions provided in important ways for welfare. Voluntary institutions continued to be important, often associated with churches. And also it has to be remembered how important the family has been everywhere for the support of family members in need. The family generally meaning women in the family, caring not just for young children, but for older and disabled family members. So the provision for welfare has to be seen as something in which the state, the family, and the voluntary sector work together, but with the state often supporting the family to greater degrees in some countries than others. It's not the case in most countries that where state welfare grew, it pushed out family care or the voluntary sector. Certainly it's true in Britain, and I'd be surprised if it wasn't true in other European countries, that they've continued to be very strong. And if anything, state support makes it easier for families to care for, say, older people. If there's a sick older person, it's easier for the family to help if they've got a nurse coming in to help them, for example. So it's certainly sometimes said, in fact I heard it being said on the British radio this morning when I was listening, that the growth of the state pushes out the voluntary sector, but it certainly isn't true. As I've said, during the Second World War, in Britain there were plans laid for new and improved welfare systems after the war. Very importantly, in 1942, a report written by a man called William Beveridge, who had been involved in social issues since the beginning of the 20th century, when he'd written an analysis of unemployment and influenced the introduction of unemployment insurance and employment offices, exchanges in the 1900s. So he had a long record of involvement in the British welfare state. He was set by the government to survey and recommend improvements to the social insurance system. And he recommended integrating the different systems that had built up since the beginning of the century for old age pensions, widows' pensions, which had been introduced in 1925, sickness insurance, unemployment insurance, maternity benefits, recommended their integration into a single system, and also that it should cover the whole population. Previously, these schemes had been focused either on skilled workers or on the poorest people. Insurance benefits like unemployment and health on skilled workers, pensions on, and widows' pensions on the very poor. But he argued that the whole population should contribute to a national insurance system, and everybody should receive benefits. He believed this was important so the entire population felt involved in the system and felt a responsibility for it. This was precisely to avoid welfare being seen as something to be disparaged and only for the very poor, for those who couldn't help themselves. He felt that everybody should feel that they had a responsibility to contribute towards the needs of others and also should benefit. But the very rich were taxed on their benefits, so there's a redistributive element in the whole system. He felt that assisted social integration, a genuinely kind of social state where everybody felt that the welfare system belonged to them and so had an investment in keeping it going. There's always the fear with the welfare system, if it's concentrated only on the poor, then the richer taxpayers may vote to get rid of it, as has tended to happen. So he believed very strongly in promoting social solidarity between classes. It was also true that many people who were not the poorest and had, say, lower middle class jobs as clerks, sometimes school teachers, would not earn enough money to provide good pensions, good health care for themselves or education for their children, and needed a universal welfare state as much as anyone. But Beveridge also believed that social insurance benefits should provide enough for people to live on when they were sick or old or unemployed, but not more than that. Above that level, people should save, ideally through non-profit savings organisations. Beveridge was a liberal, he wasn't a socialist, and he believed essentially in the state providing what he called a safety net, enough for everyone to survive on, but if they wanted more, then they should save. And that's remained the principle in Britain, and is a real difference from most other West European countries, where there was the growth, particularly after the war, of insurance benefits that were related to income. And this has always been rather resisted in Britain as somehow being unequal, though in fact having flat rate benefits just perpetuates existing inequalities. So I think a very real difference in the principle of the British welfare state compared with those that developed after the war in other European countries is this commitment to a rather residual system on top of which people or their employers provide, rather than systems, say in the case of pensions, in many other European countries are designed to provide a rather higher replacement of working time, of income during working life when people retire. And in fact, the benefits that were implemented by the Labour government after the war were actually at a rather lower level even than Beveridge suggested. They miscalculated the level at which they should be paid. Also, Beveridge wanted them introduced over a long period so they could build up to an adequate level. Labour wanted to introduce benefits very quickly, and they were actually quite low. So we've had, since the Second World War, actually the worst state pensions and benefits in Europe. And poorer pensioners always had to supplement them with income-tested additional benefits. Alongside social insurance was introduced something called national assistance, which replaced the old poor law and which provided these income-related supplements for very large numbers of poor people, especially women. Better off people, for example, for pensions, have them supplemented through employer-based schemes, work-based schemes, which were reasonably adequate. This is true also in the public sector, but tended to discriminate against women and the low paid, because the pensions were related to years of work and levels of pay. Women worked for fewer years, mainly, particularly if they had children, than men, and had lower pay, and so tended to have lower pensions later in life, and that's still true. Most European pension schemes also have a large employment-related element, but much more strictly regulated by the state and generally more generous. They're still tending to discriminate against people who don't have long working records, like many women. particularly conservative governments, encouraged the growth of employment-related benefits through tax incentives. But also in 1948, Labour introduced a free national health service, which, unlike those in some other European countries, doesn't require any kind of payment when they visit a doctor or hospital. In some other countries you have to pay and then it's reimbursed. But the system introduced in Britain provided free attendance by a local doctor, free hospital care, free medicine. People from 1950 had to pay a small amount for medicine, dental care, and a whole range of services such as eye care, spectacles, became available free on the health service, dentistry, which had not been so before, which was a massive benefit to many poor people. For example, it's been a habit among some working class people before 1948 that as a 21st birthday present, sometimes people would have their parents would pay for them to have their teeth removed and have new dentures for the rest of their life to save them the pain of having bad teeth and the cost of going to a dentist. It was so expensive. And people would wear the spectacles that were left to them by dead relatives because they couldn't afford to buy new ones. And I imagine this must have happened in most countries before there were health systems. But the advantage of a national health service was people no longer had to do basic things like that seem unimaginable now. But I do wonder what happens in some parts of the United States. So, whereas the social security system implemented by the Labour government had considerable weaknesses, the health service was much more successful and has continued to be extremely popular and on the whole very effective. There was also improvement in education. The school leaving age was raised to 15, having been 14 before. There was the expansion of social services and also subsidies for people to use the legal system, which made it possible, for example, for some people to get divorces who couldn't afford it before. So what was implemented was quite a wide-ranging new set of welfare provision in Britain, and in other countries similar but not the same things developed in Western Europe in the years to follow. Now, most of them, when it passed the 1950s, did more than Britain and spent a higher proportion of their gross domestic product on welfare than Britain did. By the end of the 1950s, Britain is quite far down the league table of expenditure in Western Europe. Scandinavia, again, is in the lead. But the countries of Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and also Ireland in Northern Europe, were poorer countries, and they lagged behind. And of course, until the 1970s, Spain, Portugal, and Greece had right-wing governments. These were overthrown in the 1970s, replaced by more left-wing governments, and they joined the European Union, as Ireland did, and their economies improved, and the European Union put on pressure to improve their welfare systems. And indeed, they began to provide more welfare in order to make themselves acceptable to the European Union. Ireland previously had been much closer to the British system, but without making the improvements after the Second World War, because Ireland had been part of the United Kingdom at the beginning of the 20th century, when pensions and insurance were introduced and compulsory state education. But there hadn't been very much improvement in Ireland after it became independent until the 1970s. So by the 1970s, it was really very backward in Northern Europe in the development of welfare provision. And it was a poor country with very high migration out of Ireland to other countries, which is happening again now that it's having an economic crisis. So most West European welfare states went through a period of expansion up to the 1970s. It's important in all of them that not only is this a period of expansion of welfare, but it is the most unusual period of full employment. The first sustained period of full employment in peacetime in European history. And it went on for a long time, and that was probably more important in raising standards of living. The fact that more people were in work all the time and had adequate jobs and could begin to save and improve their standards. And in addition then have the support of a welfare state when they couldn't work, which really did bring major changes in living standards in the 50s, 60s and into the 1970s. And with it, a narrowing of the income gap in most of these countries. The noticeable narrowing from the end of the Second World War. What welfare states did in most countries was to create what Beveridge had called a safety net. So the poorest people did not fall so far behind the rising living standards of everybody else that they would have done before. People who couldn't work because they were too old or sick or unemployed didn't fall so far behind. They fell further behind in Britain than elsewhere, but even there, not as far behind as they would have done before, and indeed have done since the 1970s. So most West European, particularly Northwest European countries went through this period of full employment, expansion of welfare provision from the end of the Second World War to the 1970s. An important element of this was the influence of the European Union, which was formed as a European Economic Community in 1957, committed from the start to promoting high living standards, high standards of welfare provision and work security. Again, rather like the League of Nations before the war, which I mentioned earlier, again, this kind of supranational, international institution played a role in setting standards for governments. They don't always listen to them, and particularly the British government since joining has often been reluctant to listen, but even it has found it hard wholly to reject the kind of standards that have been set on social inequality generally, but on things like levels of pensions. The United Kingdom didn't join the European Union until 1973. There was a considerable expansion in the 1970s, including the southern European countries, Britain and Ireland. But the United Kingdom also felt it had to conform to some of its standards. So the period from 1945 to the 1970s was an interesting and unusual period in many ways. And full employment and welfare became a consensus in European liberal democracies after World War II. And it was this consensus that influenced the formation of the European Union. In Eastern Europe, from 1948, then communist regimes were in charge, providing, as I was saying earlier, state-centralized welfare, security of employment, and theoretically there was no unemployment in the communist countries. So even though people actually had nothing very much to do, they formally had a job and an income. That was another way of providing security, though it didn't do much for economic growth in many of these countries. But it did provide basic pensions, childcare, other kinds of healthcare, other quite good levels of education. In all of these countries. Then in 1989, communism came to an end. East Germany later merged with Western Germany, and with its welfare system, that's a considerable cost to Western Germany because Eastern Germany was very poor by then. What happened afterwards varied from country to country, but in general there was a shift to a mix of market-provided healthcare and education provision, and also very basic state-provided social assistance. The International Monetary Fund, which has never been a great fan of social welfare, had a great deal of influence on the reconstruction of these post-communist states and tended to discourage the development of generous systems of welfare, or even moderately generous systems of welfare. So there was a shift to a varied mix of kinds of provision. But mostly retaining, at least in principle, basic safety nets of social assistance. But these were quite quickly eroded in some countries, and the result was a growing income gap, the erosion of the value of state pensions and other benefits, the removal of the childcare that women had come to take for granted to enable them to go out to work in most countries. The more prosperous countries, such as the Czech Republic, could keep relatively high levels of benefit. Poorer countries, such as Poland, could not. Then in 2004, the countries of Central Europe, not Russia, joined the European Union. But there's still very considerable variation in their standards and big gaps in income, which varies really according to the economic prosperity of the countries, which in some cases, such as Poland, is now improving. But it's hard to see that in most cases their welfare systems are improved after 1989. Though they didn't always necessarily get very much worse, though the income gap certainly has grown in most of those countries. So by the 1970s, most countries of Northwest Europe had welfare states which differed in details in some of their structures, but in general offered their populations very good education, healthcare, security in old age and unemployment, benefits for children. And as I say, the income gap in most of them had narrowed. Welfare states were getting more and more expensive. One thing that was particularly expensive was healthcare, precisely because medicine greatly improved in what it could do. But the costs of drugs, the costs of new technology, costs of making the benefits of good healthcare available to everybody grew. So it did become extremely expensive. Also, people's standards rose as people got accustomed to good standards of provision. They, of course, wanted more. A big difference by the late 1970s was that most people expected to be healthy, whereas most populations through most of history would not have expected to be healthy. Now, if people are not healthy, they feel there's something wrong, whereas for most of human history, it would have been normal, probably, not to feel entirely healthy. But the better conditions get, the more people expect. And so keeping up with the cost, and of course once people know, for example, there's a good drug for some illness, then everybody wants it, and this puts pressure on the costs of systems, understandably. So the costs of keeping welfare states going, and of course the other important element that was only beginning to be noticed in the 70s, became much more evident in the 90s, was the ageing of populations, and so the growing costs of pensions. But despite the costs, in most countries, welfare states continued to expand up to the mid-1970s. And in general, living standards in most of these countries were incomparably higher than they'd ever been before. There was still what was defined as poverty, but poverty had come to mean something very different by the 1970s compared with the 1900s. It was no longer being defined by social scientists as not having enough to eat or a place to live. It was coming to be defined relatively to the standards of other people. That it's when you fell behind the average standard of the population that you were deemed to be poor, when you couldn't share the same activities as most of the population. So definitions of poverty, and consequently what welfare states were about, were rather different by the 1970s, which I suppose contributed to this question of what are welfare states for. Then came the economic crisis of the 1970s, stimulated by the rapidly rising cost of oil, but preceded by considerable international inflation. And the post-war European consensus on welfare began to be challenged in many countries. As we were saying earlier, increasing numbers of people blamed the costs of the welfare state for delaying recovery, rather than seeing welfare as a way to expand economic growth. It was seen as diverting investment into, say, healthcare and away from investing in industrial development, and so harming economies. And the economic crisis did lead to most countries, to some degree, in the 1980s, reassessing their commitment to welfare expenditure, seeking to restructure or to cut it, and in some cases to transfer responsibility, when possible, from the state to the individual to buy provision in the private market. This went further in some countries than others, and went furthest in countries where there were right-wing governments. For example, Denmark from the end of the 1970s, and Britain, where we had conservative governments from 1979, first of all led by Margaret Thatcher, and then by successors, up to 1997. But particularly in the 1980s, there were very serious attempts to cut benefits and to shift services away from being universal for the whole population, but to concentrate them on the poorest people. The problem with concentrating or targeting benefits on poor people, it always sounds a very sensible thing to do, concentrate your resources on the most needy. But the problem is, A, it's very expensive to find out who really needs services or benefits, such as pensions or whatever, because you have to assess people's income, and their income may change, so you have to keep up with those changes. So it can be very costly. It's actually cheaper to pay to everybody and then tax them. It's much more straightforward. The other problem is that when you have selective benefits of that kind for the poorest or for those in greatest need, a certain proportion of them won't apply, so needy people are left out. And for example, we've had, for the last few years, quite a good selective supplement to the state pension, but 20% of all eligible pensioners don't apply for it. And that seems to be conventional in most countries. The way you have a selective benefit, 15 to 20% of the people in need don't get it. And the country that's tried hardest to end this has been Canada. But even there, 10% of people don't apply. Which often happens because the people in greatest need are the ones who are often less educated, or they're old and sick and isolated. They don't know what's available to them, or they don't know how to set about it. I think people who really are very poor or in difficulties are the least knowledgeable about how to work welfare systems. And so the problem of selective systems is it leaves out too many people in real need. And if it's possible to pay benefits to the whole population, but then redistribute through taxation, then that's both cheaper and does get the benefits to everybody. But running really effective social welfare systems, especially social security systems, is complicated. But there was a shift both in Britain and in Denmark towards more selective as distinct from universal benefits. But it was found, as I suggested earlier, that those benefits that were already rather selective were easier to cut. For example, in Britain, the social housing sector, housing funded by the state, rented housing for poorer people, was quite severely cut back in the 1980s and has led to a severe shortage of housing for poorer people ever since. And the similar things happened in Denmark. Benefits from which the entire community really gained, such as in Britain, the National Health Service, were very much harder to cut. Margaret Thatcher was quite anxious to cut the National Health Service and encourage people to use private medicine, but was surprisingly unsuccessful. More people did use private medicine, but it's not always very good. And because the health service was available and people thought highly of it, there was a great deal of resistance to cutting it too severely. But certainly the Conservatives in this period in Britain did erode the quality of welfare services. The value of pensions fell. The health service continued, but the hospitals weren't cleaned as well as before. There were much higher levels of infection. The quality of service deteriorated. People had to wait longer to get medical attention. And similarly, the quality of education deteriorated. Became an occupation that good graduates were less willing to go into. So there was a very real erosion, even of those elements of the welfare state that were popular. But even whereas in Britain attempts to refocus welfare states, and they did go further in Britain in the 1980s than in most European countries, even there the total cost of social welfare went up, not down. This was partly because of the rising costs that I mentioned before, but also because there was high unemployment, and the government didn't dare not pay benefits to the unemployed with very political opposition. And there were new social problems emerging, which were costly. One was the ageing of the population, which was becoming very evident in the 1980s. And older people couldn't be totally neglected. Also, there was a much higher rate of marriage breakup, so many more single mothers looking after children, often on low incomes, and again, requiring some kind of support. So the cost particularly of unemployment, but also other kinds of social issues, meant that costs still carried on rising. And what happened, particularly again in Britain, was that the safety net was withdrawn and there was growing income inequality. The net that had prevented the poorest people falling behind as general incomes rose was removed, and the gap between rich and poor grew and continued to grow through the 1980s and 1990s. Taxation on people on higher earnings was reduced, and benefits were removed from people at the bottom. I think in most countries there were certain modifications to welfare services in the 1980s, but few other countries went quite as far. Again, helped by the European Union, trying to keep standards up. But as I've said, since the 1970s, most European welfare states have struggled to contain costs, particularly those of healthcare, and the costs associated with aging populations, such as the cost of pensions and care. In general, left of centre governments tried to maintain the welfare state, and some centre-right governments, as far as they can, whilst reconstructing provision. Their reconstruction often faces popular opposition. For example, the general move in recent years to raise retirement ages throughout Europe has met a great deal of opposition. This is obviously partly a cost-cutting exercise, but it also is one that makes sense because more people are fit and able to work to later ages. And one way of helping to keep economies reasonably active is to keep skilled and experienced older people at work. But this has faced opposition in most countries, very notably in France, where there were demonstrations recently, but quite strongly in most countries, that gradually retirement ages are rising. And I think it's certain to go on rising. But in general, the left and centre governments have tried to maintain and reconstruct welfare states. And certainly the Labour governments in office in the United Kingdom from 1997 to earlier this year did a great deal to restore the cuts that the Conservative governments had put in place in the years before, but whilst tending to shift to more targeted, income-tested benefits. Labour introduced a minimum wage for the first time. Britain's one of the last countries in the world, or in the developed world, to introduce a minimum wage, though a rather low one. But it did particularly benefit women workers. It introduced these pension supplements which boosted the income of low wage of pensioners to an adequate level, because, as I said, state pensions had always been so bad, but 20% of people didn't apply for them. They introduced educational maintenance allowances, which paid young people to stay on at school past the official leaving age of 16 in order to improve their skills and increase their employability. Because Britain for a long time had the highest proportion of people leaving the school at 16 and not staying longer in education of any Northwest European country. And these allowances were highly successful in encouraging young people to stay at school, college, get better qualifications and better jobs. There was a slight narrowing of income inequality and 600,000 fewer children in poverty over the period Labour was in office. The health service was very much improved again, having been so badly eroded, and death rates fell. And in fact, fewer people used private health services during this period, despite rising incomes, and despite a fashion for cosmetic surgery, which is only available in the private sector. Hospitals were cleaned up and became less riddled with infection than they'd been under the Conservatives. So that by 1909, even the International Monetary Fund, which isn't a fan of socialised medicine, was praising the National Health Service, that it was doing well by international comparisons. Unemployment fell until the crisis in 2008. And much was done to improve security of employment and help and advise the long-term unemployed into work. There were still great weaknesses. There's still great shortage of housing, which is very costly. The British housing market has a much higher rate of owner occupation. People own their houses, increasingly since the 1980s, rather than renting, which again is unlike many other West European countries. And the costs have gone up really very high, which makes it very difficult for poorer people to live, particularly in the cities where there's work. And the Labour governments did too little to stop that. And they were unwilling to raise tax levels for increasingly large numbers of people on very high incomes in order to put more money into essential services like housing and also care services, particularly for older people, were still in quite bad shape, too often employing low-paid, untrained immigrant or undertrained immigrant carers who didn't have the opportunity to be good enough at the job. So there were very real improvements after the erosion of the 1980s and most of the 90s, but still problems. And then since May 2010, there's a new Conservative-led government, which already in its first few months is going further than Margaret Thatcher or any other European government I can think of in seeking to cut welfare benefits, disability benefits, healthcare and housing. It's already cut the educational subsidies that enabled children to stay on at school and gain more skills, cut the services that helped the long-term unemployed get into jobs. It's adopting a rhetoric rather like that of the 19th century poor law, the assumption that people living on welfare benefits are lazy and have to be forced to look for work, while at the same time making less work available, particularly through severe cuts to public sector jobs. And in fact, there's very little evidence that there are very many people who are just living on benefits because they're too lazy to work. And most benefits are so low that it's hardly likely many people would think it was a desirable option. And as I've said, they've cut the very services which would help people into work. It's obviously early days for government for this government, and hard to assess the long-term impact, but it does look worrying. But their argument always is, given the severity of the economic crisis, which they tend to exaggerate, it's necessary to make these cuts if the economy is to recover. So it's a complete turnaround from the early 20th century in the discourse about the relationship between welfare and the economy. But fortunately for the rest of Europe, nothing quite so severe seems to be happening elsewhere except in Ireland, which is undergoing a serious crisis at the moment. So the current economic crisis does seem to be provoking another reassessment of welfare states, rather like the 1970s, more in some countries than others, and as in the late 70s and 80s, more in Britain and other European countries. And it's still very early, and we've yet to see how the crisis will work out and what its impact will be. So it's very unclear. As we've seen, what happened in Western Europe after the Second World War was expansion of welfare states in Western Europe and narrowing of income inequality. From the 1970s onwards, a tendency to cut and question the welfare state and a growth of inequalities, particularly in Britain. A certain improvement in the 2000s, but now the current crisis and the outcome of that isn't quite clear. So I'll stop. And any questions and comments? Yes.
You said voluntary institutions and family's role was not pushed out in the process of expansion of welfare states. In everywhere, in every countries.
Well, I haven't seen any good comparative studies. The only comparative studies I've seen relate to older people, because that's what I work on, and that certainly shows very high levels of family support. And there's a kind of rhetoric in Europe about how families don't look after their old people. Again, I heard it on the BBC radio this morning. But when you actually look at it, they do a very great deal. And they may be much less likely than parts of Asia for older people to move to live with the younger generation. But they very often live not very far away, and there is a great deal of support given. And certainly in Britain, the welfare services tend to assume that if there's a daughter at hand, she will do a great deal of the caring. But I do think services have tended to support the family rather than actually to make it easier often for families to care. And for example, in Britain, since when they were introduced, there's something called a carer's allowance. So somebody who is a carer now gets payment, but used not to be the case. So it means if somebody has to give up their job to look after a disabled or elderly relative, they're getting some kind of income. It's not wildly generous, but it exists. So I think the family is very important, and it's often underestimated how important it is.
Yeah, well, I asked this question because I observed a kind of fashion of the research topic of the role of extended family in welfare provision in Europe and the role of communities. I just wondered if it is something to do with the reality, the recovery of the roles of, the coming back of the role of family in welfare provision is reality or just in discourse? This is my question.
I don't think it's a coming back. I think it's always been there. I think it's come into the discourse. Partly because of a greater rhetoric from governments about how it doesn't exist, and so you've got to encourage more voluntary action, something the present government is making a big noise about is the importance of developing more voluntary action. And it's implying that there isn't very much, it's gone away. In fact, it's extremely strong. And there has been actually more historical research on what's been recently and what's been, I'm going to talk about it next week, on what's been happening over the last 100 years. And if anything, the growth of the state has encouraged the growth of voluntary action. It's subsidized it very often. And similarly, the more people say the family isn't doing things, the more some researchers like me start to ask the question, well, does the family not do it? And in fact, people haven't really done the research. It's something that's quite hard to measure over time, because there aren't statistics of family care, not very good. So you have to use all kinds of qualitative methods. But the more it's looked into, the more evident it is that there's a lot of it around.
Maybe the Japanese government is the forerunner in the use of the discourse of the important family. Yeah, it happened in 1980s. isn't it quite early?
Yes, so that's interesting. I think it was Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s trying to push more social welfare services onto the voluntary sector that made people start looking seriously at the role of the voluntary sector. Because I think a lot of us had always written at that point as though the voluntary sector was bound to dwindle, the state would be bound to take over. When we realised that the state wasn't taking over, then I think we started to ask the question, what has been happening to the voluntary sector? What role does it play? And particularly, of course, when people in the voluntary sector were saying, well, we can't take on these roles. But, you know, but we wanted the state to do certain things because only the state has the resources to provide, say, old age pensions or large-scale care. There's certain things that families can do and voluntary organisations can do, other things that the state can better do. So I think it just made us think more carefully about what's going on, who's making provision, which was quite useful. It is in the 1980s, when it was part of the Conservative government's attempt to erode what the state did and to encourage the voluntary sector to take over, which people in the voluntary sector found very frightening because they knew they couldn't do it. And it's interesting how this new Conservative government is picking up the same rhetoric of the 1980s Conservatives, and very much faster, and taking it further. It took the Thatcher government a long time to build up to these kinds of ideas, and slowly try to persuade people. This government has immediately gone straight into it in a very extreme way. And it's also made a lot of mess-ups. It's making policy too quickly and making bad mistakes. For example, it's announced a cut in child benefit, which is paid to all children up to the age of, I think, the age of 18 if they stay at school. And it was put in place in the 1970s. And the government very quickly announced it would be cut to people paying tax at a higher rate. At a certain income, you pay 40% of your income in tax, and that rate is about £44,000 a year. But they forgot that men and women are separately taxed. And so the outcome of that is in a household where both husband and wife or partners are both working, but both earn a bit less than 44,000. They keep their child benefit. A household with just one income, but it's a bit above 44,000, they lose their benefit, which obviously is unequal. And that was a kind of obvious point they should have thought of, but they didn't, which is stupid. So, and there have been a lot of errors of that kind, because they're in such a hurry to implement cuts.
starting to discuss unconditional citizens' income. Are there any such movements in Berkeley as well? I mean, I can't imagine, but from what you said.
There have been certainly people proposing a citizen's pension. They haven't pushed it beyond the pension. For the reason I said before, that if everybody was given a decent pension and then richer people were taxed, then everyone would get it. And in fact, this government has, one of the few people I approve of in this government is a Liberal Democrat who is the pensions minister, who actually is a former lecturer in social policy and really knows what he's talking about. And he has proposed, I gather, a citizen's pension, but we've yet to see what the details would be. So I think if he can actually achieve that, that would be it. But it hasn't been. In Germany, are they applying it to other kinds of benefits?
Well, the Liberal Democrats had it in there when they campaigned. They had it in there, but they didn't really put it in the coalition treaty with the Christian Democrats. But I just brought it up because I'm wondering what the future of the welfare state then will be, if it's always going to be dependent on the economic situation of the country, or if the discussion is going not to be, if people are going to pay for the welfare state, but how they're going to pay for it. And those discussions usually come with a discussion about restructuring the whole tax system, making it progressive income tax and consumer tax.
Well, I think those are the two ways it can go, and I certainly would favour the second one. And that was the thing that the Labour governments really shied away from. They weren't willing to reconstruct the tax system. So we've got very rich people actually evading large amounts of tax. And the government did very little to try to stop the tax havens, which are places like the Channel Isles, which are part of Britain, as well as various kind of remnants of the British Empire, like the Cayman Islands, which still are supposedly in the Commonwealth. And nothing was done to stop people shifting huge amounts of money and avoiding tax. And one thing this government seems to be doing is pushing everybody's anger against welfare recipients and not against these people who don't pay any tax, which I think is deeply shocking. And there are, of course, people saying this kind of thing, but they're not very influential. And certainly there's scope for reconstructing tax systems in ways that means that people do pay the very real costs of the welfare system. And certainly I would favour having citizens type benefits, and then tax all of us who don't really need benefits without, at least can afford to contribute more than we do to. So I think if that kind of debate can take place, it would be a healthy thing. I don't see it happening in Britain anytime soon, but maybe more hope in other countries. And there are examples like Norway that seem to have quite high levels of tax, high levels of redistribution, good services. But again, it's a very much smaller country than Britain or Germany, and have the enormous advantage of a large income from North Sea oil. They found they had a lot of oil sitting in the North Sea within their boundaries. But unlike the British government, have the good sense of the government to keep owning it and getting the profits which they were able to plough into good services. And that's done Norway a great deal of good.
You didn't mention gender in this, today's lecture after 1980s, the part on 1980s. But well, gender has become a big issue in welfare states in Europe at that time. Didn't it change the regime, gender regime of welfare state? Male breadwinner things.
I suppose, to some extent, there's still great gender differences. Above all, I know more about the pension system than anywhere else, and that's where there's very great inequality. And it's certainly true, but it's true in all systems. Women have somewhat greater protection in other European countries, but anywhere where the pension is even partially dependent on employment discriminates against women. And there has been an introduction, again the EU has been encouraging it, to give women compensation for the years that they're out of employment, caring either for children or older people, so that they get additional contributions to their pension fund. And that has brought some improvements, but not quite enough. And I suppose welfare regimes have less of an assumption that all women are dependent on a man, because of course that's the reality. More women are living independently, often with children, since the 1980s. That's made a change. And again, it varies from country to country to what extent women are assumed, but the reality of whether women are working and independent varies from country to country.
I have chances to talk with researchers in the field of feminist welfare states. So they usually consider the period after 1980s was a period of policy changes in many countries to encourage women's employment. So I'm always intrigued because this same period is also called the period of welfare retrenchment, and also the period when the government encouraged families' role in welfare provision. So I'd like to know how these three elements are related to each other, and whether you think the feminist welfare states theorists are overemphasizing the change.
Yes, I think it will be. I think the trouble, and it's also a problem with S.B. Anderson and his typologies, is they're thinking too much about social insurance systems and not enough about all the rest of the welfare state. I mean, formally, the way social insurance was set up in many countries after the war, it did assume that most women were dependent upon a man's insurance contribution. It wasn't always quite as simple as that. And there's been a certain shift away from that. But in respect for other aspects of the welfare state, and particularly the caring aspects, the service aspects, if anything, there's been a reinforcement of women's responsibility. Sometimes older women who are doing the caring, who are retired, who are not necessarily it's a lot more complicated than they suggest. I think the Mel Redminer model is an oversimplification to begin with, and then the shift away is also an oversimplification. Perhaps it's time to stop. It's been really okay, well, thank you for listening. I'll see you again next week. And I think I have to set you some work to do. On the family point, the work that Mayumi